Greetings to you. Welcome back to Coaching for Impact. Today's topic is amazing, and I can't wait to dive right straight in. And I believe that actually, indeed, you've been taking stock, and right now, your life is on the line. So welcome to today's podcast. My name is Nadini Ochieng.
And my name is Newton CLA, a co-host at Coaching for Impact. It's a pleasure to be here.
Beautiful. So it's a wonderful day today. Now, Newton, the topic for today, failing forward. I mean, failing forward. It sounds interesting. I mean, for me, I take it when you fail, you don't wake up. You first of all need to wait and realize.
To recover. You know, we never talk politics in our Coaching for Impact, yes. But I was just thinking about the just concluded AU elections and just failing for forward. So at the risk of not sounding like I'm leaning on one side, I know there are people that really had to fail forward. It's interesting, Pasi, because we say that we are taught when you're growing up to be afraid of failure.
That's true.
Yet, probably failure is the one thing that really shapes us. You know, if you don't fall down when you're running, if you don't fall down when you're... I remember we used to climb in my granddad's home, you know, the trees for lakwats, and half the time you would fall. You know, you would be playing in mud, and half the time you would fall.
That's true.
Why is it so important that we should appreciate failing forward? From my perspective, I would say it's because it makes you better. And maybe it's a lesson that you need to be able to grasp and use it to sharpen yourself. That's what, for me, failing forward is. I don't know what failing forward is for you.
I think for me, failing forward, it's an interesting one. And actually, it got me thinking a lot. For me, failing forward is basically stock taking. Take a stock, get to understand the baggage you're carrying that you need to let go, and what is good that you need to carry forward. In basic terms, that for me is what failing forward means. It basically means stop first and realize why you failed in the first place. Now, once you do that, then you know if it's my shoes, as you're saying, when you're climbing up the loquat tree, you realize maybe I shouldn't be having shoes.
Or I shouldn't have been doing too many things at the same time.
At the same time, I shouldn't be talking. I shouldn't be asking whether granddad is coming with a stick as I'm up on the tree. Maybe that's the reason. So that for me is stock taking. And then just letting go of the baggage that would cause you to fail. But here's a question, Newton. Someone is out there and he's saying, I've done stock taking. What would you advise to be the elements that they need to look out for in their stock taking? Because that's very key.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I appreciate that growing up, we didn't talk so much about our decision-making pathway or critical thinking, these big words that we are now using. But for me, I always find that by the time you find yourself at a failure, there's a certain path that you had pursued, there's a certain process that you had used, and maybe it's within that process that you need to be able to unpack. I'll give you a typical example, right? And this week, one of the things we've been talking about, even in our book club, as you know, was clear thinking and decision making. So you invested in this thing. You thought you had done your homework, and then absolutely, becomes a failure. For me, failing forward is just going back and saying, what step did I miss out that I should have, this investment seems so lucrative. Is there something that I sort of missed out? And that's a difference between somebody who fails forward and somebody who does that and then almost immediately gets into another decision that is very similar to the one that you failed in the first place. So you've not learned anything from that. And of course, the other aspect is failing forward means you're able to dust yourself and say, what, I can be able to restart afresh, but I take the lessons to become better.
Now, what about Newton, someone who completely is afraid of failing and thinks that it's not worth it to risk?
So that's another problem. I think when you have an abundance of caution, chances are, and I want to link to what we were saying earlier in our previous podcast about beginning with the end in mind, then you will not achieve anything. Because ultimately, life is an adventure. But an adventure has to have its risks and its own benefits. So I think there are going to be hits and misses. What you try to do with failing forward is to try and reduce the number of misses that you have. But when you have an abundance of caution, as somebody says, you can end up staying in the house, not doing anything, and you remember the story in the Bible, and I think it was one of the talents, isn't it?
And also there is in Proverbs, it talks about this person who is basically a laggard, who says he'll not go out, there's a lion in the street. There's a lion in the streets. Yes. It's so interesting. And that's exactly what you're saying there. I think one of the things I've seen in my life is that Newton, I've had to basically learn to challenge myself. I'm one person who's very calculated. And with calculated people, we tend to really do our best to minimize the risks. Yes. As in, you have gone through the pros and the cons. You know what outweighs this one. But imagine still there's failure with that. So I had to learn quickly that then fail is part of life. And I have to embrace it, in that if I fail, then I dust myself and say, wow, that was a beautiful try. It didn't work out, but I had an enjoying moment in what I was doing. And I think, Newton, that's what's important. What we enjoy in what we do. Not necessarily the very success at the end, but the enjoying of what we do. If we miss that, then we miss. And
the lessons, isn't it? Yeah. Because I think everybody stumbles and falls down. And you look back, you're like, by the way, I completely missed out to see that there's a gaping hole right in front of me. But what is more important is that I get to rise up. And that's step number one. Because a lot of our people, and I believe also within our audience today, the biggest challenge you have is that you fall down and you feel like the world is falling apart. I've seen people, and it's not in a bad way, but even in heartbreaks, isn't it? Even in relationships, like you're saying, sometimes you make mistakes, but you need to be able to rise up and say, you know what, I have learned my mistake, and I'm going to be able to move much more purposed, but keeping in mind that this is what I have learned. I think with our audience today, the biggest risk is that some are still down, and some don't actually get to leave that position where they have fallen down. And it then negates the whole purpose of failing forward. Because failing forward means that you have been able to pick yourself. You've learned the lesson, no matter how bitter, how painful it is, and you know how best to move in the next direction. Maybe what I would want to ask you is, do you have an example of somebody that you feel actually did not fail forward, and as a result really had very bad consequences?
Hey, Newton, mine are many, and mine can be personal. I think I can learn from my own dad's life. I actually looked at him and thought he had so many chances in life. I can't necessarily say he didn't plan, but there are those things you look back to and say, I wish my dad did this and this at this particular period, because we are people who lived with our father most of our life. I think I can give that as an example. Number one, in that you must always predict that tomorrow is coming. You can't live all your life. I know the Bible, okay, I'm a preacher, and the Bible says we live a day at a time. But the same Bible also says that a wise man leaves inheritance for his children's children. So the Bible necessarily doesn't say you don't plan. And I think for that is what, when I look at like my life, my dad's life, I would pick out that element, because most of the things that now have been put in place, I feel they are things that should have been put in place quite earlier on in life. And maybe just to challenge someone out there, I know we talk about planning, and we've talked about planning so many times. Also realize, Newton, that the Bible says that planning is unto man. In that God, despite the fact he's saying that you live one day at a time, he's saying you must have a plan in place. So in other words, God is telling us, I like this quote that we don't necessarily have the earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. And I like that quote because it basically is saying the same thing. In that everything we do today, we must have the children or the future generations in mind. For me, I feel that is what failing forward, I would say, would look like. But another question I would have, maybe you talk about Newton, and I think in the book Failing Forward by John Maxwell, there's a statement he says that you must learn to remove you from the failure. I feel that's a powerful point, Newton, if
It
you
is,
can.
it is, because for me, actually, the more I was thinking about personal examples, I've had within my own family, you know, siblings and relatives that have struggled. And one example that comes to mind is especially on addiction and alcoholism, right? And sometimes it feels like it's a spiraling effect where they feel like they have failed. But and I know it is difficult to be able to look at the lessons that you have learned, the time that you have lost, your own family that maybe you have gotten, you know, disengaged and distant from. But just to pick on what you're saying, and John Maxwell really highlights, sometimes when you sort of separate the you from the failure, it's accepting that I didn't make the best of decisions when it came to that. But I need to be able to learn and be able to move. And I think for me, sad as it is also, I've seen people that struggled and eventually it has, even in my own family, cost them their own lives because they could not really come to that terms and say, this was a mistake, I need to be able to learn and be able to move forward. Failing forward is important. And in some cases, maybe it may not have as much ramifications or impact, but I've also seen instances where when you don't fail forward, it can actually cost you your life. And I think it's important for our audience today to realize that nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. But what is important is knowing when you can be able to reflect back, take the lessons, and based on that, become better in your next move. Wow. You know, that is really important. And by the way, that to me would be my encouragement to our audience today, even as my parting shot.
Wow, that is beautiful. And I think as we wrap up this topic today, much has been said. And I believe that you have really jotted down and you are able to again pick up and have a good action point concerning what we talked about today. Now, failing forward, for me, my parting shot is failure is part of life. And through failure, we get to have a new way for us forward. Without failing, then we will continue on the same path. Actually, failure is a warning. I take it as a warning. In that you pause, take this as a pause, and recalibrate and move forward. Have a wonderful time, and I'm believing that I'll see you next time. Please call on a friend, and please tag on friends and let them join more, because we are building a community where we want to create impact. Blessings.
And fail forward.
Fail forward.
Thank you.